So last time that we were here, we learned how to conjugate verbs in the imperfect. And we learned that the imperfect was another method that we could use to talk about the past tense. Now, what does that mean for us? The subject of this video will be to discuss the difference between the preterite and the imperfect, and how to know when we would use each one of those scenarios. This is just a brief encapsulation of this topic. This is just meant to be a short, small kind of encapsulation of this topic. So if we have the preterite and the imperfect to both talk about past events, how do we use one, or why do we use one as opposed to the other? Why would a native Spanish speaker choose one over the other? These are the kind of questions that we want to answer in the process of this video. So let's look at times that we would use the preterite as opposed to the imperfect, because believe it or not, they are not interchangeable. You cannot use one in the way that you would use another. You would use the preterite for one type of talking about the past, and you would use the imperfect for another way of talking about the past. You would not use one interchangeably with the other. However, you would, in a dialogue, very easily switch back and forth between one or the other. In fact, actually, you would flow between the preterite and the imperfect if you were telling someone about a vacation that you took, or about a past trip, or about your childhood, for example. You would switch between them relatively easily, using one for one type of scenario and another for different types of scenarios. So what are the scenarios, or what are the situations in which we would use the preterite as opposed to the imperfect? Well, times when we would use the preterite is when we are discussing singular or series of singular actions or events with a definite beginning and end. So what does that mean? Let's unpack that a little bit. So what does it mean if I say I'm using the preterite for singular actions or a series of singular actions? Let's say I go to the doctor, right? I went to the doctor last week, and I go to my coworker and I want to tell them all about my doctor's visit. I want to tell him about how he gave me a shot, and that made me really upset. So if I want to say he gave me a shot, right, me dio una inyección, I would use the preterite for that, because the doctor only injected me the one time during the appointment, right? He maybe had to take my blood, or maybe he had to give me a shot of some kind of medication, but he only did it just the one time, right? So that would be a singular action. Now, if I'm thinking about a series of singular actions, let's say the doctor, while he's examining me, he makes me open my mouth, he makes me stick my tongue out, he checks my heart rate, right? Those are a series of singular actions because he only ever did them just the one time, right? He only made me stick my tongue out once, he only wanted to take my temperature one time, he only wanted to check my heart just the one time. So those would be what we would think of as a series of singular actions. So what do I mean then by the second one? Events with a definite beginning and end. If I want to think about an event with a definite beginning and end, a really good way to think about that is a trip, right? If I went to the doctor, that is an event in my life that had a definite beginning and a definite end, right? I started at the doctor's office and I ended at the doctor's office at a certain time in the past, right? I was there and I left. If I went on vacation to Mexico, even if I went for multiple weeks, or if I was only there 3 days, that is still an event that began in the past and it also ended in the past, even though it encapsulated a series of days. So any type of event that had a definite beginning in the past and it also had a definite end in the past, we would use the preterite to discuss it, even if it was only one day. If I went with my family to Disneyland, I would still use, or I would say that I went to Disneyland in the preterite because that event began in the past and it ended in the past. So if I want to think about then scenarios that I would use the imperfect for, what would I use the imperfect for? I would use the imperfect for actions that are in process, habitual or repeated actions that occurred in the past, and also for descriptions. So what do I mean when I say those things? What I mean is, if I'm thinking about actions in process, I'm thinking about actions that began in the past but haven't ended in the present, or may not have ended in the present, I'm not sure. let's say that my coworker was out sick last Tuesday and she's never come back. Well, I may not know that she's well at this time. I may believe that her disease is still happening at this moment. So I would use the imperfect to say, ella estaba enferma. She was sick, but I'm not sure if that has ended in the present. I think it could be an action that's still in process. Or let's say I started an assignment, but I haven't finished it in the present. It's not quite over yet. I would also use the imperfect to discuss that assignment. Trabajaba o estaba estudiando, something of that nature, right? If I wanted to talk about a habitual or repeated action in the past, what I am saying is, as opposed to a singular action or something that only occurred one time, I am now saying that that action occurred multiple times in the past. It was maybe commonplace, or it was maybe something that I did for a series of Tuesdays. For example, if I wanted to say that every summer I would go on vacation with my grandmother, I would use the imperfect to discuss that because it was a habitual repeated action that occurred in the past. If I wanted to also say that every Tuesday I would go with my father to the movies for one particular summer when I was 8 years old, I would still use the imperfect because that action occurred over a series of Tuesdays in the past. As opposed to thinking of a singular time that I went with my father to the movies. If I want to say, last Tuesday I went with my father to the movies, that is one time I went with my father to the movies, so it is a singular action. If I want to say, every Tuesday for the summer that I was 8 years old, I went with my father to the movies, I would use the imperfect, because I am talking about a habitual action that occurred in the past. For example, if I think about my doctor's visit again, using these ideas of the imperfect. If I'm still sick in the present, even though I got an injection, that's an action that began in the past, but is still continuing on in the present. If, for example, when I was at the doctor's office, he couldn't get a pulse and he had to try multiple times to get my pulse, that would be a habitual action that occurred in the past, so I could use the imperfect for that. Or if, for example, right, he had to take multiple vials of blood, then I could say, right, he gave me multiple injections. So that would have been a habitual action that occurred in the past as opposed to only occurring one time. If I wanted to say that when I was at my doctor's visit, I saw a nurse in the doctor's office and I thought he was very good looking, well, that would be a description of him, so I would use also the imperfect. So let's take an actual example of an event in the past or something that occurred in the past and see how we would use the preterite and the imperfect, kind of switching between the two, even though they are not interchangeable. So here's an example of a time where I'm talking about a vacation that I took with my family to the mountains. So let's see when we would use the preterite and when we would use the imperfect. Here, in the beginning, I say, El año pasado fui a las montañas con mi familia. The verb that we have here is fui. And we know that that verb is a preterite. This scenario fits the criteria for a preterite because I am saying that I went on vacation with my family and I'm back from that vacation, so that is a vacation that began in the past and it also ended in the past. So this would be an event with a definite beginning and end in the past. Here, right, I can say, rentamos una cabaña. So we rented a cabin when we were in the mountains, and we only rented that cabin the one time, and we rented it for our vacation. So this would fall under the criteria of a singular action that occurred in the past. So here also, I would use a preterite. Then I say, todos los días íbamos de excursión en las montañas. So I'm saying not just once, but every time, every day on the days that we were on vacation, I went hiking with my family in the mountains. So if I want to say every day we went hiking in the mountains, that would not just be the one time that we were there, we went hiking. We didn't just go hiking one time, we went many times, right? So because we went many times, that would have been a habitual or repeated action that we did while we were on vacation. So I know that I would use the imperfect. Next I say, también por las tardes montábamos a caballo. So here's my verb. And we know that that verb is in the imperfect. But that makes sense because I'm saying in the afternoons, multiple times in a row, we went and we rode on horseback. So that's, again, a habitual or repeated action that occurred in the past. And so I would use the imperfect. Fue un tiempo divertido. Here I have fue, which we know is a preterite. And that makes sense because that one vacation, that one time was a really good time. So I'm talking about that vacation. So I'm saying that one time it was really nice. So in a way I'm talking about my event with a definite beginning and end. And so I would use the preterite. Here, when I say la naturaleza era bella y encantadora. So I said, right, that the nature that we saw while we were there was very beautiful. Here I have era, which we will remember is an imperfect form of ser. And I would use era because I am describing the nature that we saw on our trip. So I would use the imperfect there. There are a couple of keys that can help us to see when we would use the imperfect and when we would use the preterite. For example, here I say el año pasado. So I'm saying last year, just the one time, right? Just last year, this was when I took this vacation. I don't say every year we take this vacation. I didn't say multiple times other years we took this vacation. I'm saying 1 year, last year, we took this vacation. So it's only happened the one time. That would be a clear clue that I would necessarily need to use the preterite. Here, right, I have todos los días. And so I'm saying los días, so I know that there are going to be plural days. There's going to be more than one day. So I know that I'm probably talking about a habitual or repeated action in the past. Again, here I use the plural for afternoons. So I know that I'm talking about habitual actions in the past. And here, our clue that we're in the preterite, right? Un tiempo, meaning one time, right? One time it was really fun. So these are our clues to tell us that we are in the preterite or that we are in the imperfect. All right, now that we have learned the difference between the preterite and the imperfect, what I would like for you to do is write down 2 situations in which you would use the preterite on the front of a note card and then write a sentence that is an example of that situation. For example, we would use the preterite for events, and I wrote an example. Yo fui a Canadá el año pasado. I went to Canada last year. And then also for singular actions in the past, right? El doctor me examinó. The doctor examined me, right? One action that happened in the past. On the back of that same note card, I would like you to write 2 situations in which you would use the imperfect. So for example, things that are in process, still in the present, but began in the past. Eliana estaba enferma la semana pasada. Eliana became sick last week, but we don't know if she's still maybe sick. Also for habits or repeated actions in the past. For example, Rafael y su abuelo iban al cine cada martes. Rafael and his grandfather would go to the movies every Tuesday, right? So you can write each one of those things and then write one sentence that is an example of each one of those and pop it on the corkboard whenever you get to class, and I'll check it as soon as I get a chance. And as always, be prepared to share just in case I decide to call on you. Thanks, and I will see you in class.